and welcome to The Real Math of Business with Alena Bennett, where you plus this podcast equals better decisions. Hi, I'm Alena Bennett, speaker, author, and leadership expert. I work with chief executive officers and chief financial officers really to help them create universally investable companies where people serve people and the math just works. Today, we are going to be talking to the incredible David Gunn, but before we get straight into it, I want to just share what I'm thinking at the moment, or what I'm noticing at the moment, otherwise known as the WINATM. Now, we know here in Australia, 30 June marks the end of financial year. And what I've noticed as I've walked around the shops and kind of observed what's happening in the media, there's been far less end of financial year fanfare than previous years. And it kind of got me thinking, why is that? Is it because businesses have kind of across the board cut marketing budgets? We know that cost control is a real focus at the moment. Maybe end of financial year doesn't hold the same significance as before. And maybe that 30 June time marker doesn't act the same, isn't the same as before. End of financial year used to be a time of great intensity and opportunity. I saw this here in Australia when I was in practice and also in the States as well, just at 31 December. But maybe not anymore. And it kind of got me thinking, why could that be? Is it because the intensity at all other times of the year has risen to that same level of intensity? Maybe companies are, seeming to extract just as much opportunity at those dips or those valleys at other times of year. And I guess this is what I've seen in the work that I do with CFOs. The end of financial year, whatever that may be for you, used to be a huge deal. I used to call it their grand final, for want of a better term. But it's almost like this grand final has become business as usual, which could be a good thing. It could be reflective of a great control environment, mature systems, processes, which means that the CFO really doesn't have to dive deep and get lost in end of financial year like they've had to do in the past. But it also could be because there are so many other big things that occupy a CFO's mind, which mean they can't focus on the end of financial year. And that could be risky. So the question that's got me thinking is, so what does that mean about cadences of companies these days? Is there a cadence and flow anymore? Or is it just full on all the time? And if that's the case, can companies burn out? We've talked a lot about personal burnout over the last 5 to 10 years, and particularly as we kind of emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. But can a company burn out? And is your company at risk of burning out? So the thought-provoking question that I'd love for you to kind of take away from this little section is, what is the cadence of your company? And is your company at risk of burnout? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And now over to the conversation with the awesome David Gunn. Well, hello and welcome, David. I'm so excited to have you appearing on the Real Math of Business podcast, where really that is all about creating businesses where people serve people and the math just works. And, if you're watching or listening to this, you might be thinking, why would you have a risk guy on a podcast called The Real Math of Business? Well, that's one of the things I really want to explore with you, because one of the things that really attracts me to you and your approach to business is you bring a completely different and far more strategic and clever approach to risk. So welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alena. Looking forward to the chat.
Excellent. Now, I think I'm just going to address the elephant in the room straight away because it's so cool. No risk it, no biscuit. Tell me a little bit about why. I think it's fun, but tell me a little bit about why that's meaningful. Why do you want to wear it? Tell me a little bit about what that means to you.
Yeah, look, I feel this was the opportunity to roll out the T-shirt. But yeah, look, it's a phrase. I think it comes from an old American football coach. Like, it's attributed to there, but it was about, like, you don't win things if you don't take risks. And it was really a mentality that he had throughout his team. But it's something I've talked about with my wife who's a marketer, and I was going, look, the risk needs to do a better job of selling itself. And just as I was finishing up at my last role, I decided to go out and play soccer and ripped my Achilles. And she very kindly got me this T-shirt as a reflection of, look, no risk it, no biscuit. You're living your mentality and what you're trying to do, albeit there wasn't really an upside from what I did because I just walked about in crutches and a boot for 10 weeks. But yeah, so like I felt this was a perfect opportunity. No, we've spoken many times on how I think about risk, and
Yeah.
really the underlying meaning behind this is you've got to take risk in a life and in a business.
And I love that so much. And as a wife, a number of other thoughts came into my head, but we might save that for an offline conversation. All I will say is you guys sound like a match made in heaven. Now, you mentioned around the idea of selling yourself and, risk selling themselves. And I thought it'd be worth just, I guess, recapping how we came to know each other and sort of how we've become not only in a client relationship, but a friend relationship. I had the great benefit of working in my early career with an awesome CFO called Emma Roach, and she was one of your colleagues at Rural Co. And your CFO at the time, the awesome Adrian Gratwick, brought me in to do some work with the executive team. And whilst that was, that was really leadership development work for the team and galvanizing the team and, with all the work that you guys were doing, what that really was about elevating the profile of the CFO team at the time, right? And I think this is a real, I think why I'm raising that is I think that what you and I really bond over from a mindset perspective is that these so-called support functions are actually, they're not support functions. They are probably the most strategic because they are enterprise-wide and because of the type of people that naturally gravitate to those areas in the business, traditionally introverted, humble, very diligent, that with the whole sales mindset or selling yourself mindset, those two things are at odds. So it's been a great privilege to kind of come into your world and work alongside you in the meeting of the minds. And then obviously we had the opportunity to work together when you started at Xero in a very turbulent time of a context. So I'm super excited to explore your career journey, your mindset, your experiences, because I think there's a real alignment between what the real math of business is all about and functions like risk,
Yeah.
and then what people can take away from your wisdom and expertise.
Yeah, like I mean, you've touched on how we met, and it was superb timing for me because you changed, I think, the way we thought of ourselves at Rural Co as a function, which was great. But also then when I joined Xero, the whole like we were working through the whole five dysfunctions of teams and building trust and all these things, and it was a huge part of what Xero was about. They had internal training courses, and it was a perfect introduction to all these ingredients of what makes a great team and how you should think. So yeah, obviously appreciate you piquing our kind of interest in these topics, and I've enjoyed keeping in touch since.
So tell me a little bit more about your career journey, and maybe what I would love to learn is you have this mindset that we're going to really deep dive into in terms of what is risk, what does it mean, how does it manifest itself, both in terms of culture and finances, otherwise known as the real math of business. What I would be really interested in knowing as you kind of share a little bit more about your career trajectory, how that mindset changed, or if you've always had it. I'd love to know how that sort of evolved for you.
Yeah, like it's an interesting one. Like I think there's definitely an element of me and my DNA that is positive. I think that's just part of my personality. In fact, I did a recent Clifts and Strengths, and I think it was my number one strength, which is positivity.
Oh, wow.
So that I think naturally just breeds this attitude that I've had. And certainly if I think of my career, coming into risk and evolving through different roles and businesses and obviously moving up in terms of leading teams, I think I've very much started with that technical view on it. Like risk is about methodology and process, and you've got to chase things down and stop them happening. But I think as I got through and interacted with more senior leaders, lots of different functions, you soon realize that, look, there's elements of that, but that's not really what the core purpose of risk and risk management and these associated functions are. It's actually much more strategic. It's much more about enabling the business to make bold moves, go and have a crack at certain things, but also maintain, not drop the ball, reach reputation, trust, and all these things. So I think, yeah, over my career, I feel I've definitely there's a positive connotation, which is sometimes unusual in probably the risk world, where there's always this kind of pull to negativity and mitigation and that aspect of risk. But really, I've always, I think, just had this natural affiliation to the upside. And I think for me, the real game changer, and it was actually while I was at Ruralco, and as we talked about Adrian, where I was talking about like doing some study, and he encouraged me to do this exec MBA course. And one of the modules there was going over to San Francisco and visiting a bunch of tech companies. And I just came back completely energized on, wow, they're just doing risk in a way that probably extreme in some cases, but they just aren't afraid. They are not afraid of having a crack. And that's almost the DNA of these businesses. And one of the assignments I wrote was saying, oh, it'd be really interesting, and it's tricky because you've got ASX obligations. If you're a listed business, it's really hard sometimes to focus on the long term because you've got, whether it's quarterly, 6 monthly, your annual results where you're being held accountable. So, like, but it just that trip and that exercise and the exec MBA really changed my thinking again on it. Just supercharged how I felt strongly that your risk is a real enabler to strategy.
So can I just, and this is a little bit of I'll say this is a deviation, but I have to ask the question. I think you're absolutely right. There is no way that anyone would go, a chief risk officer's number one strength is positivity. That word is just not, typically associated with risk, right? How did you get into risk? Why risk?
Well, there's slightly an amusing story there.
Go for it.
I actually started when I left school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I started doing this quantity surveying course because my dad knew the head lecturer and I really was not into it. And then one day in the middle of Glasgow, I'd been in a shop and was walking out and I actually didn't realise the glass door was still shut. So I basically head-butted the door open, nearly knocked myself out. And anyway, over the course of the next couple of weeks, there was a couple of friends I had who were doing this course on risk management, and they were saying, "Oh, look, you should probably get compensation for that," because they didn't have the little dots along the door. I was thinking, well, I should get compensation for being an idiot and walking into a door. But anyway, I got something like £200. It was good in the days, that paid for a few nights out in the union. But it actually got me talking to a few people in this risk management course, and that was almost like an interaction and a moment where I thought, actually, that sounds really interesting. It was a degree in risk management at Glasgow Caledonian University. I think at the time, the only place that did a pure degree in Europe. And that was really my stepping stone into this whole career, I guess, that I had no idea about. And I still think back, actually, the first day in that course, the head lecturer saying, look, and it's a phrase that stuck with me. Risk management is common sense, but it's not always common practice. And that, like, it was just, I don't remember lots from university, as you'll say. However, that phrase was one that stuck with me because I've seen it play out for many years since.
Wow. I'm really glad we went down that little rabbit hole because I can actually see you on stage delivering a speech in San Francisco, wearing that T-shirt, telling that story and just changing people's perceptions straight away on how you can approach risk management. I love that. I love that. Obviously, the trip to San Francisco was pivotal for you and you were really, it sounds like you were really surrounded by this mindset of, we got to just have a crack. We got to make bold moves. So, that was a real eye-opener. That was a real game changer for you. And then you've come back and obviously you've found a role that aligned perfectly with that mindset and that ethos as well. Without going into the detail yet with Xero specifically, I'm curious about where the business landscape is in terms of that mindset, because what I see is a lot of status quo, mediocrity, conservatism, fear, uncertainty, particularly in these times. I'm curious about what your observations are sort of broadly, maybe globally, maybe things have changed over time. I think that, make bold moves, have a crack. Is that where the world is going or is that still unique?
Yeah. I think it is a good question, and particularly right now, because I've been catching up actually with a lot of contacts over the last 2 or 3 months, and there is obviously a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty just seems to be the word of the moment. Uncertainty in AI, the two hot topics. But I think it's definitely having some impact. I mean, obviously all the tariff situation in the US is just causing concern in a number of businesses. I think some have been pausing and been forced to just be a little bit more conservative around what they do, where they invest. Some others have potentially not been impacted as badly, and it's full steam ahead for them. But it feels like there's every week or so there's some other big change. And again, the word that I think I'm hearing a lot come out is resilience. Like resilience to is accepting that this probably is the world. There's geopolitical tensions, there's economic challenges, there's still opportunities if you are in the right place, doing the right thing. There's maybe a little bit of luck in that, but I think resilience is something that is a word, a buzzword at the moment that I've heard a lot of, and I can see why, because I think the whole thinking behind resilience is you have to be a bit agile and adaptable. You can't predict to an exact nature. You're probably, unlike financial aspects and the maths of finance, where like you add numbers together, it gives you an answer, but you can't necessarily do that with some of the business decisions I think that companies are forced with now.
Tell me about you've just used the word resilience, and I am casting my mind back a number of years ago now, where you shared your views on resilience. You remember you saying, people think resilience is this, but how I interpret resilience in the context of strategic risk and your definition of strategic risk, this is what I think. I'm wondering if maybe you can share what your belief is around risk management, strategic risk, and then your views on how do we be resilient? How do we make sure that we can still make bold moves and have a crack when we see opportunity without the fear that I'm going to be the next company on the front of the AFR or what have you?
Yeah. Two elements of that, and I feel very lucky because the last 5 years I've had some amazing people I've worked with, including Steve Vamos, Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, who came in and has written a book on risk taking, which really helps when your CEO and okay, it was a slightly different, it's career risk taking, but the concepts are the same, and really that it aligned very much with what already I had adapted as Xero as the philosophy for risk, which is about, it's really smart risk taking is the ethos that sits behind it. It's this decision making and smart risk taking, because that's really that's the live element. That's almost like the risk in motion element of every business. There's decisions being made all the time, every day. Smart people who are hired for a reason, who are trying to do the right thing. Generally,
Yeah.
most people are. They come into work and they want to make good decisions. They want to improve the business, and therefore smart risk taking is part of everybody's DNA. So I see the role of like good strategic risk function of enabling them to do that. It's not trying to build a big risk function that has to be involved in every decision. There's maybe some complex big decisions where that makes sense, but many decisions should be and are happening across any business on any given day. So I think that for me is some of the strategic way I think about how risk needs to be embedded in a simple, smart and seamless way, embedded into the way the business already operates. But then the other piece to that is being open and trying to generate a culture where, look, it's all right if it's not an exact science. It's okay if things don't go 100% to plan. And that for me is where the resilience piece comes in. And it's thinking upfront and early on what might go wrong. It's being aware of the signals and the metrics that might suggest things are going off track, and being ready the right time to step in and pause, stop, course correct. And I think for me, it's just the interaction of these are almost the secret sauce. Like a lot of the focus can be on reporting and the governance, and I think there is a place for that. But that for me is it's the periodic sense check and oversight piece. The actual live living aspects of risk management are what happens in between that.
I've been making notes since you've been talking, because there's so much that you're talking about. And the things that really stuck out for me is that smart risk taking needs to be part of everybody's DNA. You also used the phrase in motion. I think you might have said risk in motion or something. So there's a very live, living element. Like risk is not a sit in the box, we pull it out every quarter, we look at the risk register, blah, 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 blah. We put it back in the drawer and forget about it until something goes wrong. We don't do that. It's living, it's in motion, and it needs to be part of everybody's DNA. That to me goes, hang on, you don't do risk, you do people.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe if we kind of talk in real life, you started at Xero right after the pandemic. So at what we all understood as probably the most risky, uncertain time that we had ever really lived through as business professionals. There was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. Business were literally shutting up shop going, we don't know what our next move is. So you started at Xero at a very high risk time for everybody. How did you go about making and think about every single individual that worked at Xero? I'm gonna close off. I'm scared. I'm not only scared for the business, I'm scared for my personal health. I'm scared for my family's personal health. Everyone's brains, everyone's minds would have been so closed off. How did you go about stepping into a business in that role where, yes, being on the front cover of the paper was actually a real reality for high profile businesses like Xero? How did you go about trying to create this culture of smart risk taking where smart risk taking was part of everyone's DNA, and that risk was an in motion, not even concept, it was something that you wanted people to live and breathe? How did you practically do that during that time?
Yeah, wow, it's bringing back some interesting memories. I mean, it was literally the week before COVID I started, so I
Yeah.
think it was in the Sydney office, and then we were shut down. And I think what helped there was the whole business culture, actually. Now, every business would have been faced with similar challenges, but I think Xero has what I still look at as a very unique culture and a very caring culture. One of their values was, human. And that was about caring for people and looking out for people. So that as a starting point, I think gave us, but me also, a head start because it was something to hook into. And you sort of touched on a really important point there where for all the risk activities I've done, and it's not just been at Xero, but I think it's been probably the best and most explicit at Xero, was trying to hook in language and ideas to the existing language that the business uses and not trying to create new risk speak, for want of a better word. So it's tying it into the 5 values that we had at the time of the business. It's not trying to ram down frameworks and detailed processes across everybody. It's being purposeful about where you spend your time. Because there are many parts of the business that were, but like if I think of your COVID, there was a huge cross-functional team. I mean, I was day one, first day meeting with Kirsty, my boss, and she said, "Oh, by the way, this crisis management team was set up over the weekend. It's in an hour. You're co-chairing it with a great guy, Colin Brown, who luckily was there 2 weeks before me and did some of the heavy lifting there." But that was instantly getting people from across the entire business. Sometimes there were 60, 70 people on these crisis calls, senior leaders trying to do what they can, trying to lean in, trying to support risk decision making on what do we do, when do we shut offices, how do we support our staff. So that was, in some ways, I look at that as a real tailwind for risk and the function, because it was a real live, living, back to that kind of living element of it, example of people thinking about risks and making decisions and trying to do right for the business and the people within the business and all our customers and other stakeholders. So that was probably, for me, it was a really good intro. But off the back of that was just, again, finding some words that the business already had to start hooking in some of the risk concepts, simple concepts. And there were 6 that I always used, and I've told many people about them, and I still love them. They apply to any business, I think. Simple, smart, and seamless. I think I mentioned them earlier. These are words that Xero used for other operational aspects, but when you think of the meaning of them, even like the seamless part, it's like, don't do risk as a separate thing. Try and embed that into existing processes. So people almost don't realize they're doing risk management. It's part of their product development cycle. It's part of their marketing campaign decision making. It's not a risk process on the side. But then the other ones, and I love them. It was David Thodey, and I'm sure you won't mind me mentioning it. He's a great chair, super experienced, very supportive all along. And up front, he sent an email, I think, around a few of the board members and senior leadership saying, I've always really supported risk management. I know its value. It's just always so hard to make it relevant, impactful, and alive. And these three words, again, are superb. So I took them, I stole them from David, and just weaved them into the way we internally talked and shared and you spoke to people about risk. Because if what you're doing is not relevant and it's not having an impact and it's not actually being used, then it's not adding value. And therefore you should be really questioning that there's got to be a better way of doing it.
You just used the phrase adding value. So we're going to go there. But obviously what's really clear is you found, as a result of your personal and career evolution, you found the perfect place for you to be at Xero, which is wonderful. And the culture was really ready for someone with your mindset to come in and really make risk simple, smart, seamless, relevant, impactful, and most importantly, alive. So that's wonderful. You then mentioned adding value. Tell me, those particularly in Australia, but also globally, will know the success story that Xero has been. But tell me how you sold yourself. How did you really demonstrate to the organisation that risk was adding value? Because that is a day-to-day challenge for these so-called support functions that aren't out there selling the wares, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, obviously we talked about the COVID piece, and that I think was almost a comfort blanket. Now it wasn't like that wasn't just me, but I think there was almost a psychological safety net there. People thought, oh, thank goodness we've got this risk function being stepped up and we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And that certainly helped because it enabled me to just bring some of my experiences from previous places where we already potentially had thought through and thought about scenarios and impacts, albeit not probably at the scale of the pandemic. But I think, I mean, actually, when I think back, actually, funnily enough, like the conversations you and I had, because obviously I kind of spoke to you and you were a coach for me, which was fantastic up front, but it was storytelling. It was how do you, if I think back, actually, even as my first interview when I was going for the role there, it was like, look, we'd like you to come in and introduce risk to the business, but maybe not use the word risk if you can. I know it was a bit of a standing joke throughout the interview process. Now, I didn't go to that extreme, but what you and I spoke about up front was, look, in this innovative, growing tech business success story, like it's great they are now realizing they want to mature the space, but the last thing you want to do is come in and start ramming down technical terms and frameworks. So for me, it was just being selective, probably appreciating what got Xero to where it had was not, it didn't have a risk function, it didn't have a defined risk appetite, for example, but it had a risk appetite. It had all these things that when you look at them are risk appetite. So just because it didn't have a document that said this is a risk appetite statement, it was a living environment where it was there, it was embedded in how they did things. So for me, it was spending the time speaking to people, engaging, understanding their challenges, what they see as opportunities, where I, as a function, can maybe plug a grey area that falls between different functions, but also just recognizing the good things that were there. And I still remember the first update I'd given to the audit committee was saying, look, whilst you maybe haven't had a formalized risk function, you've actually got a load of really great risk activities, processes. It's more about how we coordinate that and get more value out of them. And that was really hooking in to strategy, priorities, and not getting sidetracked by spot fires.
There's that positivity coming through as well.
Yes.
I'm kind of listening to you and I'm going, you saw all the good things. And you saw, yeah, and you not only saw them, you called them out. You talked, obviously, language is so important. You see language as a really powerful tool, and that has worked to your advantage. But I think, yeah, what you just described is your positivity really working for you, and
Yeah,
a lot of humility as well, David, because it wasn't like you came in and went, right, I am the risk guy. I'm going to do this, 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 and this because I know that's how risk people do. You
yeah,
sat back and you went, what should we do here? And I remember you telling me at the time, oh, they keep wanting me to, they keep wanting to grow my team. They keep wanting to give me resources. And you were like, not right now. And I'm sitting there not knowing better, going, why wouldn't you take them? And you're going, you very much, goes to that words, you selective and you were patient.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was kind of unique to me, that environment at that time where
Mm.
every quarter there was an opportunity to get more people, and it was something that just, most of the other businesses I had, you had maybe a 6 monthly or annual process where you think about what you want, but things move so quickly in businesses like Xero. You
Mm.
almost did need that regular cadence of how do we underpin and support this growth of the business. But for me, that's not the right way to think about a risk function. And obviously, if there's a real need and there's a burning platform and it needs people to get on top of that quickly, you'd want to jump on that. But I think the sort of pragmatic approach, appreciating what's there. I've found, I've definitely found with other people, maybe within the team, who've come in from maybe what you could call more mature businesses. They maybe are more mature, they're bigger, they're different, but it doesn't mean that what was happening there is what Xero needs. And I think for me, that's another learning I've had, is like one size doesn't fit all. Probably like the mass of finance, like that's driven and I suppose underpinned by rules, and this is how you recognize revenue. There's
Mm.
very clear ways of doing that. But for
Yes.
me, and it's a challenge that I think all risk teams face, is there isn't really a one size fits all. There's outcomes I think that
Mm.
all risk practitioners want to get, but one size doesn't fit all, because I think there's so many different aspects of any business where you've got to learn what they are. You've got to understand what any business has as its tailwinds, its headwinds, internally and externally, before you then work out, well, what is it takes this business to the next stage.
There'd be so many people watching and listening to this going, how? Like, how do I do it? I don't live or work in this nirvana that it sounds like you have had the privilege of working in for a little while. But you just suggested that every 6 months you asked yourself a question. And I want to understand how you answered that question. You said something like, how do us risk help grow the business? And you said that question kind of came around as part of the cadence every 6 months. What did you think about in trying to answer that question?
Good question. Yeah. I mean, I think there's, like any point there where you have a team, and you and obviously the team are wanting to feel that you're doing something that's valued. And it's
Mm.
not always the case. And some of that is that silent behind the scenes work where you go,
Yeah.
well, if things don't occur, how do you measure the success of that? Like,
Yeah.
that's ultimately a challenge I think most risk functions have. But for me, it's probably the conversations and the dialogue that you're having is a good reflection of that. Or people reaching out to the team to ask for support in certain things. Like, whilst you want to empower and not build a bottleneck where people have to come to you, but if people are genuinely reaching out saying, look, we've got this project we're looking at doing, we feel there's a lot of risk in there, would you mind you or someone in the team coming along and supporting us with it? That's a good sign. Like, that
Yeah.
shows people are seeing value. But then also more at the strategic level, and it's probably, I look back and go, it's one of the probably the best sessions I've ever had, if I think of anywhere, because it was a board risk workshop. We weren't trying to solve all problems. It was a really open-ended session where there was a bit of pre-work around, like, what are the survey around all the exec team and the board members. What do you see as the biggest headwinds, tailwinds, threats, opportunities? Where
Mm.
should we take more risk? Where do you think we should take less risk? And it was pulling all that together and seeing all the areas of commonality, the areas where there's maybe slightly differing views, and then letting the conversation go from there. And to me, that was another example of not overcomplicating what is just creating a moment, creating time for people to talk openly, strategically, with a forward lens rather than just, a backward lens. And, there were decisions and ideas that came up from that session that ultimately played out, where we maybe wanted to take a bit more risk or where we had to go and invest a bit more time to be cautious or build some structure. And again, I look back on that and just think, like, being able to, that's maybe not something you have to do every 6 months because it feeds into maybe a longer term strategy, but having a cadence where you can create the space, create the moment for that conversation. Again, you do need a group of key stakeholders who support that. But I think part of that's up to people like, myself and the team to make sure the process is an easy one to engage with.
I love it how you just keep coming back to these words: simple, smart, elements of alive, impactful, relevant. It's really obvious that you live and breathe those ideas. They're not just words you say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is awesome. So as we sort of start to get to the pointy end of this conversation, remind me, I want to close with a wrap.
Oh.
Your wrap, not my wrap.
No.
But what I want to know is, if I am a CEO listening to you and I don't have what you've just described and I want what you've just described, if I'm a CFO who doesn't have what you've described or want what I described, if I'm a chief distribution officer, if I'm anyone sitting, or if I'm a board chair going, gosh, I just wish, because boards really think at that DNA culture level, right? Because again, if you know Xero, we don't need to worry about the finances, the success. That's obvious, right? You've given us all of the ingredients that contribute to that. If I'm a board chair, a CEO, a co-worker, a colleague of yours in the C-suite, and I don't have that, but I can see through what you've shared just how valuable that would be, whether it would make my life easier, whether that would make me more money, whether that would make my life less complex.
Yeah.
What do I do?
Look, I think it's ask the questions, really. I mean, I'm not the only risk practitioner that has many of these views. Like I'm part of this risk leadership network, which is, people like me, lots of different industries, senior risk leaders here globally, and quite often we'll connect whether it's online, but we had this face-to-face in Melbourne a few months ago, and really collectively there's probably 16 chief risk officers there. We all have the same vision for what good risk management should be.
Wow.
We're all, like all the businesses, have slightly different nuances of where they're at on that journey. But I think asking the question to either incumbents are there, or if you haven't got like a dedicated resource, is reaching out to whether it's consultants you use for other pieces of work, and just asking for start simply 2 or 3 steps that you can take to ask the right questions, which is questions around how can we be thinking about risk in a better way? What are other companies doing? Not trying to get down into risk systems and processes. It's a conversation. That's the most important piece of this. So, and the start of the conversation is probably asking a good question. And Alena, if you're working with them, you can probably do that because, as I've said, you probably have that superpower of asking questions that kind of go to another level of what is obvious there. Yeah. But there's people, there's many people out there who have the same thinking and desire on the value that risk can have to a business. And some of these are mature businesses, and it's hard to turn around like a big ship. But if you ask the question and you've got the tone at the top and you've got the vision of what the outcomes you'll get from it are, there's no reason why you can't start with some small steps in the right direction.
Absolutely. And I think it's so comforting to know that you are not the exception, that there actually is a movement of risk professionals like you who want to think about risk differently for the benefit not only of the people, but for the business, and then obviously the broader communities that the business supports, because we don't know what we don't know, and quite often what we know is based on our experiences. So thank you for sharing that there is this group out there. It fills me with a lot of confidence, actually. Yeah. You have said a really powerful, you said it's a conversation. I'm wondering if that needs to go on the back of your t-shirt. just an idea.
Nice. I like it.
The other thing that just popped into my head as you've talked about, this group of professionals that are out there, and you're all on the same journey, that you've all share the same mission and the same beliefs. I think it comes back to what you said at the very beginning, which is this is common sense. It's just not common practice.
Yeah.
And so you're not it doesn't sound like you're on a crusade to change the world or to show that you're smarter than anyone else or introduce any of this new language into organizations, because it is just common sense.
Yeah.
What you are trying to do is make it common practice.
Yeah.
And I think that's so powerful. And it makes sense why you've talked about things like storytelling, you've talked about language, you've talked about terminology. I cannot finish this without just sharing that you actually rapped, like you prepared and you delivered a rap. Now, when we worked together, when you started at Xero, I remember you at the time we started talking about storytelling, and you remember we used Andy Murray as a bit of an analogy and the team support that he had.
Yes.
Hang on. 5 years later, you are now rapping on stage in a senior leadership team meeting. Just tell us, because we don't know what we don't know. And I think there could be, as a close, as a fun, light way to close this, it would be fun or useful for other senior leaders to know that you really know risk it, no biscuit. And if you need to rap to get a point across, it can be done.
Look, this is down the rabbit hole of things like ChatGPT. It just makes it too easy. So like I think this actually, so I'm known as a little bit of a rapper, because I've done it a couple of times. I think
I have a rap name.
Well, like there's a little, Slack has a little emblem. So usually it was just like a Snoop Dogg. No, nothing like Snoop Dogg, obviously, but actually he was the inspiration behind the one in San Francisco. So I mean, it was funny because we were really pushed us to come up with something really simple around helping people take smart risks, and with the whole senior leadership team there, and we'd had a great couple of days, and she said, let's just launch it while everyone's here. And in my head, I was thinking I wouldn't mind another couple of days just to get. She went, what is this? What's the risk? And I was like, actually, it's a low. So that simple language. So anyway, we did it, and that morning, Snoop Dogg, for some reason, was on presenting the weather in the US, and I was like, why is Snoop Dogg on there? And I thought, we've got to have some fun in life with these things. So I just went on to ChatGPT and said, look, can you write me a rap that would be good to introduce smart risk taking at Xero? And it came up, and literally the first version that was there, I thought, that has just nailed every single key message that I would want to get out. So I did stand up. I had the sunglasses on, the hood up, launched into it. People did comment after saying, look, if nothing else, we'll absolutely remember smart risk taking. And look, to me, you need to have a bit of fun in life. And I think, that was there was a few little things happened beforehand that just thought, what's the harm in it? I was definitely living in this world of there's no risk in introducing thing with a rap. So yeah, look, it just landed, I think, really well. It helped break the ice of something that can be a dry topic. I don't think it was, because the conversation afterwards was just really great. Like, and again, everybody saying, oh, like you're jumping in with examples where we were too slow taking risks here, or we don't think about these enough. So the outcomes we wanted from that were great, and we had a bit of fun just on the way through presenting it.
And look, I guess that's a brilliant place to close, and really kind of we come full circle on how you started this risk journey in the first place. Positivity, the ability to laugh at yourself, who walks into a glass door, and your ability to use those things along your whole journey in a field that is not typically known for positivity, fun, and taking more risks.
Yeah.
I can honestly say I've never rapped on stage, and to think that I would do that kind of fills me with a lot of dread. There's a huge amount of risk that goes with that. So there is so much to take away from this, David. The things that have really struck me are that risk has to be living and breathing. And if it's not living and breathing and really part of everybody's DNA, then what's the point? Language is so important, and that appreciation and humility that let's see what works and let's just introduce and almost piggyback off what's working. You've mentioned momentum, creating moments, and cadence. And I think some people go to structure, but I think it sounds like that's been a really important part of that. How do we make it living and breathing? Well, let's just incorporate it into things that we already do. And also spotting the moments. You said that obviously, when you started at Xero, it was the perfect moment. It was a real sink or swim moment of exposure moment, but you really capitalized on that moment. We could talk about this forever. Risk is common sense, not common practice. That will stay with me forever. Thank you so much, David. Is there anything that you have not shared that you think there's just, I just want to get it off my chest. People need to know this. Is there anything else that you would like to share? Any other gold nuggets, pieces of wisdom that you think would be useful to share before we finish up today?
I don't think so. I think you've just summarized the last, 40 minutes or so perfectly. Like that's, for me, that is the secret sauce that anybody could go and try and use. So as you always do, you've just picked up, I think, the key nuggets there. It's just been great chatting to you as always.
Oh, I always enjoy and learn so much talking with you, David. If people want to learn more about you or connect with you, what's the best way for people to do that?
Look, I'm on LinkedIn and always happy to connect there. Like it's, that's a great way of just keeping in touch. I'm obviously based in Sydney at the moment, so always happy as I recover from my Achilles injury. I'm now a little bit more mobile than I was, so I'm getting in the city 2, 3 days a week and happy to catch up with people.
Wonderful. Well, do reach out if you want to have a really smart, dynamic, and a live risk conversation with David. Thank you all so much. Thank you, David. I can't thank you enough. I look forward to catching up soon. Well, you have just heard that great conversation with David Gunn. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I think his take on risk is so refreshing. So now we are going to jump straight into the listener question, the first one for the show. And today's question comes from Sandy, and I'm going to read it straight out. Hey, Alena, congratulations on the new podcast. Can't wait to listen. My question is about feeling unfulfilled in my role. I work currently as a project manager, but I'm no longer feeling engaged by my job. I'm not sure if it's the business. It feels like I may actually want to do something new. How do you know when it's time to leave or pursue something new? Cheers, Sandy. So first up, Sandy, I want to thank you so much for asking this question and also for being brave enough to recognise the thoughts and feelings that you may be having. Sitting with that tension when you show up to work every day is actually tremendously hard. And I don't get a sense from your question that you have any intention to drop the ball at work. And actually the tension that you're feeling is, I currently am doing a great job. I want to keep doing a great job, but I reckon I could be doing something better if my levels of engagement were as high as I would like them to be. So what I will say first off is well done on asking a great question. The very fact that you are thinking these things tells me that it's time for you to level up. And, I think you've got to listen to that. Now, in terms of what is actually going on and what do you want to do, I guess it's a challenging one. You said, I'm not sure if it's the business. Look, it might be the business. Context is everything. But I think one of the things that I find really exciting by the business landscape at the moment is everything is on the cards for change. Everything is open to creation. I've got a preteen and a teenage girl. So they, I often tell them, one's in year 6, one's in year 8, I often tell them the jobs that you are going to be doing once you finish school and whatever post-school education you want to do, whatever job you're wanting to do doesn't exist yet. And what I can hand on heart tell you is that when I was at university and when I was at high school, the jobs that people are doing now do not exist today. So I see that you're a project manager now. What I would strongly recommend and what I tell all of my clients is be role agnostic. Don't be tied down by a job title. You know, in my book, CFO of the Future, I talk about playing for significance, not status. And we don't mean ego significance. We mean having a significant impact on the people, your business, and the community around you. So what I really would like for you to be thinking about is, what do you love? What do you love doing? What do you love thinking about? What do you love spending your time on? I talk about that in terms of your passion. And then I say, well, what are you really good at? So passion and performance, how do you find the intersection of those two things? So I want you to really think about, what do you love doing outside of work even? You know, do you love to travel? Do you love to catch up with friends? Just capture all of those things and think about at work, what are the things that you are great at? And map those out and have a look at what the intersections or correlations of those two things are. And you might be really surprised to find the common threads that you may not have allowed yourself to think through before. What we're ultimately looking for is a North Star here. A North Star, a future life that you want to lead into, that your career progress can basically just be a step-by-step process to get you there. We are not trying to define your future today. We are not trying to get you the last job that you ever get, I don't think. What I get the sense is you want to be more engaged, you want to contribute more, and you feel like now is the right time. So context certainly counts, but I wouldn't be, without knowing more, I wouldn't say that the context is the issue. Again, I would be job or role agnostic. Think about, what do you want to do? And then think about, how do you create those attributes or those responsibilities, first of all, in the context of your current organization, because that could be easier. Then you might also think, what else might be out there? But then really, sort of turning into yourself and saying, well, what do I really want to do when I grow up? I work with people from their mid-30s to their mid-60s, and I can tell you, Sandy, people are asking themselves that question at both ends of the spectrum. So don't feel like you need to nail the answer now. You won't. You will keep asking yourself the question, but it really acts as that North Star for yourself. Have the courage to create what you want and put it on the table. What I will say, in my last corporate role, I had the opportunity to create my next role, and it was really scary at first. And then I thought, you know what? I'm going to give it a go. I got 50% of that new role. I didn't get the whole thing, but I was able to create 50% of the new role. So I would say, just to wrap it up, Sandy, well done for doing that thinking. Allow yourself to think really big and creatively, and be really courageous in starting those conversations internally. And, all the best. I love where your thinking is going, and what I know, the next step will be the right one no matter what. So thanks, Sandy. Appreciate your question. Well, thank you for listening to the first episode of The Real Math of Business with Alena Bennett. If you like this, subscribe to this channel for more, and we'll see you next time.